So good morning, everyone. Do you know that moment you feel before you do something stupid? I'm in that mood right now, so bear with me, sorry. So we are talking about getting your application production ready with Actuator. And I have to jungle with two screens here. So hi, I'm Michael. I was announced a Java champion a few years ago, which does not mean anything. It just means I write, I give talks, and you probably have more knowledge than me in certain areas, and in certain areas I know more. That's how it is. In my normal life, in my working life, I'm a consultant, so I'm working with clients, at clients, producing code, not just doing slides and writing. Actuator. So, who of you already uses Actuator? Okay, everyone. So why are you here? One of the claims of Actuator is actually making your application production ready. So what does production ready mean to you? Anybody has a meaning? Just throw it at me. Stable, reliable, okay. Some other ideas? All connections are ready, okay. Yeah, let's see. I think all in all, Actuator goes into that direction, but not everything is done by Actuator itself. There's, Actuator actually relies on all the other things that are available in the Spring ecosystem, right? So for me, Actuator was special because it's included since the beginning of Spring Boot. It was there in the 1.0 release. And it was one of the three main points that got me thinking, wow, that's possible with Spring, because I've used Spring before Spring Boot. But with Spring Boot, we had three properties that were important to me. That was, oh, I don't need an application server installation of myself. Wow, I can give configuration values from the outside. And the third one was, oh, somebody thought about getting into production and helping me there. And that was actually Actuator, which has evolved over the years. And when you ask me, I divide Actuator in two main parts. For me, one part, and that's the part we are talking the most about today, are all the endpoints that it provides to us, which we can use to solve different things. And the other part, which is maybe even more important, is the observability part. But there have been talks that are hard to top in the last years. So you can find them on YouTube, and maybe I'll show a little bit, but I doubt it. Okay, let's start with endpoints. And I'll switch into my IDE, and we will do everything live, so you can interrupt me anytime. I try to see in the audience and try to see you if you raise your hands. So we can, I have a certain path I want to take, but maybe we take some slopes around if you have questions. So enter presentation mode, and I hope it's large enough that you can see it in the back. Okay. So what's the first thing we need to do with basically everything we do in Spring Boot? What's the first thing you do when you need something new? Reading the documentation. Ah, that would be perfect if everybody does that. Very good. No, the first thing after we read the presentation is we need to include some kind of starter, right? Because in my application currently there's only the Spring Boot starter, which provides logging and the auto configuration, but nothing more. And to be honest, I have an application class as well, which does run my application. And because right now with Spring Boot Starter, it would stop after starting because it does nothing. I have just an application runner which waits for 5 minutes, so the application will still run. But we need to add a new starter. And for Actuator, it's of course the Spring Boot Actuator state starter. And every time I do that, I have to reload all Maven projects to be sure my class path is correct. So now I can start my application. And Actuator is there. But right now, Actuator is not reachable because I'm not in the web. I just have a starter, which is like a CLI application. So the next thing I will do to start slowly is we need to add, oh, that shouldn't be here, a little bit of configuration. We start by enabling the JMX mode. And I think it's enough if I reload it. So that's large enough too. Okay. So now I can start JConsole. I can find my main class, which is this. It's insecure. And I have these mbeans. And here, unfortunately, I think I can't make that any larger. But here are endpoints, like beans, caches, conditions, and health. And I can invoke the health endpoint, and I get a result. So that's what Actuator endpoints basically are. They are endpoints for informations which I can query, in this case over JMX, and some endpoints have some other operations or where I can actually change something inside the running application. But to be honest, I mean, JMX was a big thing 20 years ago, so it was the main admin interface for everything within each application server and for most of the own written applications too. But nowadays, mostly we are in the web, and to reflect that, Actuator automatically activates itself for the web if we have a web application, which we will do by adding another dependency, which is Spring Boot starter web. We could even use a webflux one. That's just a detail, and we ignore it for today. So, and to be safe, I will remove my application runner, reload my Maven projects, and restart the application. And now Actuator is not longer available via JMX because this needs to be activated explicitly, but now it's reachable by what you probably all know because you all use Actuator, right? Over the Actuator endpoint. And by default, the health endpoint is the only one which is activated because I don't know if you heard it. In the end of last year, there was a talk at a German hacker conference where they showed that they stole many data from Volkswagen because they had an older Spring Boot version where the Actuator endpoints were a little bit more exposed back then. And so somebody could take a heap dump and found passwords in the heap dump for S3, and then he could download the S3 buckets. So by default, right now, there's only the health endpoint, and if I query the health endpoint, I don't get any details. I just get a generic status. And for the purpose of this demonstration, we of course expose everything because it's easier to show if I expose everything. So I can either decide to expose something over JMX or over web, and I need to specify includes. There's an exclude too. By default, it's only health, and I could now list all the endpoints which I want to expose, which is probably the safest default, just exposing what you want to expose and not expose everything by default, right? And there's a special character, the asterisk, which exposes everything. So we expose everything right here. Need to restart. And now we have some more endpoints available. There are 2 endpoints right now as of today in the morning, or I think during the night. Spring Boot 3.5 was released. And with Spring 3.5 there are 2 special endpoints which are not even exposed now because they are so sensitive, and that's the shutdown and the heap dump endpoint. If you want to enable these, you have to do it explicitly by management endpoint shutdown access, and we can it's by default non-access, and we need to set it to read-only or unrestricted. I set it to unrestricted, and the management endpoint heap dump access unrestricted. So these two endpoints are even not exposed if I use the asterisk. That's a new thing. I think shutdown was in that state since a few versions, but heap dump is since today, basically. So if I include these, there is a shutdown endpoint and the heap dump endpoint too. And to show it, if we use the shutdown endpoint, we need to do a HTTP port there, shutting down by, and my application exits. So it's probably not the best idea to export that, right? Okay, so the next thing after including Actuator should evolve security, because you don't want any of these information exposed, right? So if you include the next starter, which is Spring Boot starter security, Spring Boot security, if it's on the class path, has an default that it protects everything, right? And I see I did not follow my path, so let me just throw it away. So what I would advise, if it's possible in your network, is you can explicitly configure the endpoints to be on another port. So my web application runs on 8080 by default, and it's a good idea to put the management interface onto a separate port, which is probably only available from within your network. So it's even harder for an attacker to get there. And that's done by setting one property. If I reload now, Actuator is not longer available on the main port, but you have another port where it's running. So now if you can do firewall rules or something like that, or even in Kubernetes, you can just expose 8080 to the outside, and 8081 you can use for internal stuff, right? So that's the first solution. And the second one is, or you can even put it on top of this, this solution is adding Spring Security. I need to reload all Maven projects, rerun my application. And now even the Actuator endpoints are secured by default. The only one that's not secured is the health endpoint. So the health endpoint is by default always reachable. There's one caveat you have to be aware of, and that's as soon as you have your own security filter chain, which you probably have, because I mean that application does nothing, but your applications hopefully does something useful. The auto configuration of Spring Security backs off, because you define your own security, and then you have to define the Actuator endpoints yourself too. So it's in your responsibility. So one thing I will do is I will set a fixed security password, because I don't want to copy it from the generated one. And now if we define our own web security, now I need my cheat sheet. Security filter. That's correct, right? Yeah, okay. Per chain, HTTP security, HTTP. We need to throw an exception. So as soon as I say HTTP and I'm only securing endpoints to slash. And let's say I have to request matches. No. Any request. So for my normal application, everybody has to log in with from default, with from login. Okay, let's build. Application restarts, and now Actuator is not longer secured because I've provided my own security, which only secures the root endpoint of my application. /Actuator is not my root endpoint, so it's not longer secured. And what I should do then is I can define a second bean, a second security filter chain, because you can provide more of them as long as they do not really overlap with the security matches. So that's the Actuator chain. Then it's the same as the above one, throws exception. And now within the security matcher we can use a special class which is called endpoint request. To any endpoint. And then we can, so this means this filter chain basically is called for every Actuator endpoint. And now we can include our own restrictions we need here. For example, we can say we want every request to permit all, so we make it completely, we have it completely public client. So we say authenticated as well, but in this case we want to use HTTP basic because I don't want a form built. So now I have two security chains, and now if I query it, it's secured again. And I can access it with a user, which is by default is the username user, and I specified the password to 1, and now it's reachable. So I think if there's any important information of this talk, that's already it. So if you activate Actuator, please, if possible, use another port, which is not exposed to the outside, and you probably should secure it too, and be aware that if you customize your security, which you probably do, you should include another filter chain explicitly for your management things. So, but we haven't looked at what does all the endpoints do, right? So we will go through a few of them. So the first one is the health endpoint, which I already showed, which shows the status of the application. So it does several checks to see if other things are available, and then it aggregates a status. And for the purpose of that demonstration, we want to show more details of this endpoint. So you can say it. You can put it to never, when authorized, and always. So when authorized, it will print the details whenever an authenticated user is there, and for an anonymous user, it's not shown. So let's say set it to when authorized. Because I'm using the user 1 and the A, I now see details, and by default, in this case, my health check is defined by 3 subcomponents, 3 sub-health checks. The disk space one, who checks how much space I have on disk left, and I can set a threshold, and if I would now produce large files and the threshold would be crossed, it would switch from status up to status down probably. There's a ping endpoint which always returns up. It's basically, it's reachable. And then there is an SSL health component. If you configure your own SSL certificates via the SSL bundles feature of Spring, these are shown here too. So these are not all health checks that are included by default, but these 3 are activated by default. And all the other endpoints activate themselves if necessary. For example, if we add something like, let's say, Spring Boot starter data Redis, reload, restart. And I need to start a Redis instance. Okay, let's restart again. Now we have because of all the auto configuration stuff, which you should be used to. Now I have the Redis starter. The Redis classes are on my class path, so by default it connects to Redis, which runs on localhost and a specified port. And Actuator also picks that up and now includes a Redis health check too. So every time I call this health check, the health check will do a command against Redis to check if a result is returned, and so if it's reachable, right? And this is included for probably any data source that's pre-configured, comes pre-configured with Spring Data. So yeah, in most of the applications you have a data store, right? And therefore you have at least one of these health checks too. And you probably need to write your own, and of course Spring being extensible, that's possible too. So we can write our own health check. Let's write it within that class. So you can you need to expose a bean of type health indicator autocompletion foo health indicator. So you could implement your own class and annotate it with @component. The important thing is that you inherit from or implement health indicator, which I'm doing here with an anonymous class. And within that, I now can return or calculate my health status. So for example, let's say return health.up with detail type or now instant now to string. And of course we need to build it, and let's make some space. So if I now compile and we go to our health endpoint, there should be the foo with the details now and the status of up. So you can include your own if needed. I think I've done that with the 1.0 release, but back then I certainly found the need. So let's enhance that a little bit. Yeah. So we can use a static atomic boolean up, new atomic boolean true, and now we can check that's here. If up get return health up, return health down, and let's add an REST controller with a get mapping. Never do that with a get mapping, by the way, where we set it to false. So now we should be able, yes, status is up. Now we can do a HTTP just to my endpoint. And I need to log in, so what should I do? We permit all. Yeah, now 200, and if I now go to my health endpoint, my status is down. So I toggle it basically. And now you see the status below is also down, because if you combine multiple of these health indicators, somebody has to calculate, given of all these status values, what's the final status, right? And by default, it's just an order of statuses, so as soon as one is down, the end result is down. But of course, I can extend it. We could say status order. We can say it's not down, out of service, up unknown. We can say it's up, down, out of service unknown. And now it's up, but my endpoint is up. I toggle it to down. And now even though my health indicator is down, the overall status is up. So that's one thing to customize it. And there's even a status aggregator interface you could implement yourself if you need some more sophisticated logic. And the second thing is these endpoints return, of course, with an HTTP status code. By default, if it's up, you get a 200. And if it's out of service or down, you get a 502. But you can remap that too if you want to. So we can do HTTP mapping, this one, and say up is 502. And now, even though it's up, we get a HTTP 502. And that's the next caveat you need to be aware of. As soon as you map one of these values, the defaults back off, and now down and out of service with response with 200. So if you want to preserve that behavior, we would need to specify them ourselves now. So that's basically a little bit the same like the security one. And what's nice to know is these health endpoints, I mean, can call them every second, but you can specify a time to live for a health endpoint. So I can say the health cache time to live is 180 seconds, which is way too long to show you, but nevertheless. Now the health is up, I toggle it to down, and now it stays up, and in 3 minutes I should have set a lower value. We could see that then the cache timeout runs out, it is refreshed, and then the value changes. And I don't know what's your target platform for production, but many of our clients use Kubernetes, and there is the concept of a readiness and a liveness probe to detect if I should restart the application because of some problems, or should I route HTTP traffic to that instance because it's ready to handle it. And that's even included within Spring Actuator and the health stuff too. And if you deploy to Kubernetes, it automatically detects that it's running within Kubernetes. I think it looks into some special environment variables. If they are there, it assumes you're running in Kubernetes. But of course, we can activate them ourselves in any case. So probes enabled, true. And now if I look at the health, I should have two groups. I have /liveness and readiness. And these by default don't do any of the checks the health endpoint does. They rely on several events published by Spring during startup or shutdown to detect, is my application already started, is the embedded web server ready to accept connections, and it triggers the status based on these events. And in our case, now we have to include the management port, right? Because I specified another port for the management one. So in our liveness probe, we have to use another port than the real traffic. And that can cause problems, because it could probably be that your management web server, because I now start basically two web servers or two listeners at least for two separate ports. So now it may be that your management port is reachable, but your real application port is not reachable. And in that case, you can add additional paths for these probes. And now these are exposed on the management port, but on the real pod as well. It's just the health checks and not any of the other actuator stuff. So if I set this to true and I can customize nearly everything, I can go to 8081 actuator health, or I can go to my main port, which is 8080/live-c or ready-v. And these basically mirror the one from the management port, but now I query it over my production port, which is more safely to do to make sure that this port is reachable, right? Yeah, and then there's a discussion. I mean, these checks basically don't check anything. So it's just for when is my application started, when I can route traffic there. And now you have to decide for your own which health checks you may or may not include here. And there are certain rules which mostly hold true. For example, if you include the database check and your database goes down, it's probably not a good idea to toggle your liveness check, because then Kubernetes thinks your application is not live because your database is not live and it restarts it. But restarting your application most of the time don't fix the connection problem to the database, and so you get in a crash back off loop and restarting. On the other way, it may be a good idea in that case to toggle your readiness probe to down, because then Kubernetes sees it and doesn't route traffic to your instance. So you don't get overwhelmed by connection errors to your database. But even in that case, you must be aware that depending on how you expose your service, if you expose over the server port in Kubernetes, if no instance is ready, it doesn't accept any connection. So your clients get wired errors. If you use a normal load balancer, normally the load balancer should respond with 503, I think. So then it's acceptable. But I mean, that's a point where you need to think and take a decision what's the best thing in your situation. Okay, health. The next endpoint, which I find useful, is info. And by default, it should show nothing, but I have messed something up. Info shows several information about your application, and by default, there are just a few enabled. The one that should be enabled is one that exposes any property you have in your application properties, application YAML, environment variable, whatever, which starts with info. So info foo equals bar should now be visible. I need to enable info, right? Management info env enabled true. OS, I enable them all. OS, Java, and process. True. So let's restart. Yeah. So now I enabled a few. The env one says everything that starts with info is included, so I'm sorry, you have to explicitly enable that yourself. That's not auto-configured. I configured Java, which gives some information about the JVM you're running, OS about your operation system, and process about how many CPUs, my garbage collectors, something like that. And then there are two additional ones, which is the build and the git. Both are enabled, and both rely on a file lying in the class path, which you normally generate during your build. So we need to extend our POM. So the build info can be generated by the Spring Boot Maven plugin if I include a goal of build info. And the second plugin artifact ID is the git commit ID Maven plugin. Yeah, this one without a version. And now I have to build on the shell, because IntelliJ tends to remove that these generated files. So now I start it again. Now I should have the Git one. But not the build one, right? So yeah, doesn't matter. So, and I even don't know where the Git one comes from, but yeah. So normally, if I wouldn't be live on stage, because debugging live on stage is hell, these two plugins generates two files, and these are picked up by these info contributors themselves and are added. And as with the health endpoints, you can write your own in that case too. So we could even produce, and this class gets messier and messier, info contributor. And within, it's basically the same as with the health. We can say builder with detail, Michael sucks. This should now be picked up too. Yeah. So you can provide whatever information you need to. Yeah. The next endpoint is env. And env shows you basically all the environment variables, but not like the shell ones, every variable that configures Spring in some certain way and is set. So it picks up anything within my own, let's see, I hope I don't spoil any secrets. So there's a properties, a server ports property source, which is picked up where some values come from. There are system properties, there are environment variables, there's application info, the dev tools provide some values, my application properties provide some values. So here I can basically, it's nice for debugging, right, on your own machine, but probably for remote environments too. And you see by default, even if you enable that endpoint, all the values are redacted by protecting these. And this is true for the env endpoint, the config props endpoint, and the quartz endpoints, because there could be secret values, and all values are masked by default. And now we can change this too by, because we are very open today, show values. The env values always, and now all the values are shown. And if you set this and you know, oh, that's a secret, or I never want to show, you can provide your own class, of course. And we can provide a sanitizing function. And now we can say if data get lowercase key equals Spring application pit, because that's the lowest one, we return that data with a value of 42. And in all other cases we return data. And now that value is always set to 42. And what we also can do is, if I take this one, we can say if data get lowercase key equals that one, return data with sanitized value. And now this one is sanitized and all the others are shown. So depending on your use case, yeah, you have all the power of Java in your hands. Two other endpoints I find useful, especially for debugging, is the beans endpoint, which lists every bean that is registered within the Spring application. So whenever I think, oh, that bean should be there, my first look is here to see, is it really registered, or did I do something wrong and it's not picked up by auto configuration, or did I miss an annotation that's required in that case? And sometimes you explicitly don't want specific beans to be there, and then you can check here, is it available? And if it's available, you often get a hint here where it was picked up from. So that's pretty useful if your application does not expect the way you want to, and you think, oh, that's because of a bean missing or of a bean too much. And I mean, it's more or less the same as the conditions one. The condition ones shows me all the auto configurations and if they are picked up or if they are not picked up, and why they are picked up or why they are not picked up. So, for example, the Tomcat WebSocket configuration is not enabled because it has an on bean condition and it could not find any bean with that name. So if I expected it to be present, I now have a clue what's the problem and how I can fix it. And of course, as with everything I showed before, you can so there are many more endpoints, and if they are all not enough, you can even write yourself your own endpoint, which is, let's write a class endpoint, which is a bad idea. Let's call it my endpoint, and it's a component and it's an endpoint. The endpoint needs to have an ID, so my ID. And now I can specify methods here. Yeah, let's say int foo. Or I think get foo is better. Return 42. And now I have to specify which operation it is. And in this case, it's the read operation. There's a delete operation or a write operation too. So depending on what you do. And if you specify your own endpoint, this can be exposed over HTTP or over JMX. And therefore, you are only allowed to use primitives as a return type or as an argument type. So if I use that one, my actuator should include the my one, and if I go to my, I get the result. So that's a generic one, and sometimes you need to do special stuff to, for example, we don't want to give the value out. In that case, we want to wrap it in a JSON object. In the case of web, you can write extensions. So it's my endpoint web extension, and that's also a component, and it's an endpoint web extension for the my endpoint. And the trick is basically we're using delegation. So we get the endpoint, let us provide it via dependency injections through our constructor, and now we define a read operation here. It even can be another name, get var, let's say it's a map, to make it more complicated to type for me. Import class, turn map of value e.getFoo. And now this extension should override the one, and we can transform values. And in the web endpoint, you can accept more complex types, because JMX only allows primitives, but web and JSON we can use maps, our own beans, classes, whatever we need. Okay, some more. I mean, I have 5 minutes left. Has anybody a question and did not raise his or her hands during the talk? Any endpoint you've never seen but want to see? Overdriven by me? Yeah, I mean, the list of endpoints is like basically we could count them, but I don't have a browser open. I think it's about 20, yes?
So a question, so the filter check for the actuator, how does it...
Can you talk in the microphone, because I can't hear you?
Hi. So you create a specific filter chain for Actuator,
Yes?
but I didn't get how this map exactly to Actuator endpoints.
Yeah. Your question was in the two security filter chains, you did not see why it maps to the actuator endpoints, right?
Yes.
So let me. The main difference is in the security matcher and the authorized request thing. You can specify either a string which matches a pattern, or you can specify a request matcher. And for the endpoints, there are certain pre-specified request matchers, which is endpoint request to any endpoint. And this request matcher, which is returned here, picks up all the configuration options you could, because you can change the path to the actuator. You don't need to use /actuator. You can say /my_management or something like that. And this request matcher picks all that up and knows where these are running, and therefore provides a dynamic pattern to detect all the endpoints. And I even can say, I mean, here are more helpers. I can say only to health. Then this request matcher which is returned would only include the health endpoint. So that's basically the trick here.
Yeah, so this endpoint request directly match to management APIs, and that's why
Yeah.
it works directly like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
I have 2 minutes. So I don't know about you, but I am pretty happy with Actuator. It evolved over the years. It got very nice additions. It's especially a good idea that they made it even safer with every release. And I think the only thing I'm sometimes missing is like an asynchronous way to switch the health. So, for example, in one of my earliest projects, but that was Spring Boot 1. Whatever times, we wanted to check an external system for health, where the health check took more like a minute to respond. And because normally the health checks are called more of the times, it would be a good idea in that case that you had a background job which runs, detects the health, and that then only switches the status of that endpoint. And there's a ticket for it. I think it's open for 3 years to provide such a mechanism in general, but it's not picked up till today. But I mean, you can build that your own, a little bit like I showed with atomic references and async scheduling of Spring. But it would be nice to have it probably included by default. But I mean, it's easy for me as a user to ask for that, and the people who build it have to maintain it, right? So there needs to be a balance. Yeah, so if you can approach me, I'm here the whole day. You can find me on several social media thingies. If you would do me a favor, please rate the talk, and rating is not that important to me, but if you have feedback about things I did not so good, or I like being greeted with we did something good too, please use the app for that. If you have questions, reach to me. I think the slides will be, I have slides with all the examples, will be published somewhere. And then thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of the day.